This video is going to talk about sediment on the seafloor and the different kinds of sediments that are there and what they tell us about the Earth. On the lower left, I have a picture of a deep sea drilling ship. And these ships go out into deep water and then they build a drill down into the seafloor using this apparatus here. And they build the drill, they go down, they drill some sediment, they bring that sediment core up, they remove it, and then they go back down, they reoccupy the same hole, and they drill again, and they keep bringing out more and more sediment. What that looks like is shown on the right here. This is a sediment core that has actually been sliced in half and sort of opened up, and there are scientists examining the different bits and pieces of types of sediments in there. As a reminder, this is one of our Unit 7A outcomes. Distinguish 4 types of seafloor sediments, where they each originate, and how they're useful for understanding worldwide climate. I'm also going to do a very brief overview of passive and active continental margins. So here's what we're going to look at: the continental margin review, and then the seafloor sediment. And there are 4 types of seafloor sediments, and they're classified based on where they come from. So there's sediment that comes from land. There's sediment that comes from organisms that live in the ocean. There's sediment that precipitates directly out of seawater. And then there's sediment that comes from aliens. Just kidding. But there is space dust, which is the 4th type of sediment. All right, so continental margins are either passive or active. A passive continental margin, such as on the east coast of South America, is a continental margin that has no tectonic activity going on. There are no plates meeting at that location. Whereas an active continental margin, such as the west coast of South America, does have plates that are interacting. And in this case, we have a plate called the Nazca Plate and the South America Plate. And it turns out the Nazca Plate is going down underneath the South American Plate. So what are the features for each of these? Well, a passive continental margin is quite quiet tectonically. It's not associated with a plate boundary, as I mentioned, so there's not much in the way of volcanic activity or earthquakes. The structure and characteristics are generally threefold: a continental shelf, a continental slope, and a continental rise. I've made a sketch here showing these. You've got the above sea level land, and then this kind of gentle sloping shelf, and then a sudden break to a steeper slope, and that shelf break is actually the true edge of the continent. We think of the coasts as being the edge of the continent, but right now sea level is relatively high, and so it's sort of flooded the true edges of the continents in some places. So if sea level were lower, if water was locked up in glaciers, this would be the edge of the coastlines. We then have the slope, which drops down to the much deeper areas of the ocean, and then the rise, which is where material from the slope has fallen. So if you imagine a mountain, and all along around the edges of the mountain, you've got material that's fallen off the mountain. That's what the rise is. So this material comes down the slope. Sometimes underwater avalanches occur, if you want to call them that. And these are called turbidity currents. And turbid water is water that is full of sediment floating through it. And we're going to talk about that again in just a second. That's why I circled the word. Then finally, we have the deepest parts of the ocean, which are called the abyssal plains. So these are the general features of a passive continental margin. An active continental margin, on the other hand, does have a plate boundary associated with it. And there are many of them around the Pacific Ocean because there are many subduction zones around the Pacific Ocean. There is volcanic activity and earthquake activity associated with these types of margins. Their features are a narrow or maybe even non-existent continental shelf, a slope that also might not be very obvious because it might be descending into a subduction zone. And when it does that, it traps sediment and scrapes off ocean crust and forms what's called an accretionary wedge. And I'm going to show you a little picture of that in just a second. And there's not really a continental rise. So here's an example that I'm going to show you. This is a convergent margin. And convergent plate boundaries occur when 2 plates are moving towards each other. So I have a plate on the left moving down underneath a plate on the right. The arrows are showing how they're moving. This is called a subduction zone. And so what happens is as that plate goes down, they get stuck and it kind of bends and it makes this little V shape, which is the trench. All right, so that's the trench right there as this plate is going down. The shelf is, as I said, narrow to non-existent. And then the accretionary wedge is material that gets trapped in the trench as those plates continue to move towards each other. So if you think about my sweater as sediment on the ocean plate, as it goes down, it gets scraped and bunched up. Okay, and so that material right there is the accretionary wedge. All right, so that was a quick overview of passive and active margins that I know you have seen in other videos, but I just wanted to summarize it quickly. So seafloor sediments cover the floor of most of the ocean, and sometimes we call them ooze. It's sort of like if you could imagine going down onto the water and walking on the seafloor, it would be kind of squishy and oozy. So we just use this word ooze for the mud that's on the seafloor. The thickness varies with the age of the seafloor, and it's the thickest in the trenches, as I just mentioned. The sources of sediment are, as I also just mentioned, turbidity currents, these underwater landslides. But then the four main types of sediment that I mentioned, from continents, the fossils or microfossils, chemical sediments, and micrometeorites. The way marine sediments are classified is by their origin. So if they're derived from land, they're called lithogenous. Genus or genetic or genesis is where something comes from. Lith means rock. So lithogenous sediment comes from the land. Biogenous comes from organisms. Hydrogenous comes from the water, and sometimes that's called authigenic. And then cosmogenous is the material that comes from outer space. So we'll look quickly at each of these. The lithogenous sediment comes from things like windblown sand. Here's the Sahara Desert in Africa, and there's a big dust storm blowing material out into the Atlantic Ocean. The deltas of rivers, when rivers reach large bodies of water, all the sediment they're carrying just kind of falls out, and that's called a delta. And then there's also shoreline erosion. This is an image from your textbook, and basically lithogenous sediment is weathered rock that's transported to the ocean by wind, river, waves, or glaciers. And this image is showing the main sources of sediment input from rivers coming from the continent. And so number 11 here is the Amazon, and number 27 here is the Ganges, and a couple other rivers that are major sources of material entering the ocean. Moving on to biogenous sediment, this is the hard remains of once living organisms. They can be shells, bones, teeth, which are part of the macroscopic types of remains, or they can be microscopic, which is the more significant one in terms of what we're going to be talking about. The tiny little microscopic organisms have shells, or actually we call them tests, that once the organism dies, will settle through the water column and land on the bottom of the seafloor. We call it a biogenic ooze if there's 30% or more biogenic material, 30% or more tests among the lithogenic material. Mainly, these little organisms are algae and protozoans. And so algae are photosynthesizing organisms and protozoans are little tiny animals. Mostly these are plankton that are free floating and then end up dying after their rather short life, and they fall to the bottom of the seafloor. They're commonly made of either calcium carbonate, which we're going to learn is also called calcite and is a part of what makes up limestone, or silica, which you can think of as something very resistant like quartz. So we can have calcareous oozes, which have a lot of the calcium carbonate types of shells, siliceous oozes, which have a lot of the silica shells, and then there's also phosphate material such as bones, teeth, and scales. And these are just pictures here of these microscopic plankton. Here's a place in England called the White Cliffs of Dover, and this is layer upon layer upon layer of these microorganisms that make up a limestone called chalk, and there's some people up there for scale. The climate information that we can get from these little organisms is important because different species of plankton thrive at different temperatures. So by identifying them in the sediment cores, they're sort of a proxy for the past temperatures of the ocean. We can also examine something called oxygen isotopes that give us information about past ocean temperatures as well as a little bit of information about sea level. Moving on to the third type of sediment are the hydrogenous sediments. These are minerals that crystallize directly from seawater. They include things like manganese nodules, calcium carbonates, which again is a limestone, metal sulfides, evaporites, like if you think of evaporating a large salty lake, you get salts left behind. Iron manganese nodules are pretty interesting. They're pretty large and they have a lot of iron and manganese in them. And they're very important economically. Manganese is an important metal. And they look like this picture here. And what's interesting is we really don't know how they form. So it's a pretty big puzzle when it comes to marine chemistry. Here's an old photo of somebody collecting these. These things appear on the seafloor in large groups. And again, we're not really sure how they form. Finally, cosmogenous sediment, space dust. So this is a little micrometeorite. Things can come from space that are large, like meteors, but then there's a lot of microscopic dust that falls on our Earth, which you probably don't realize. And in fact, there's over 300,000 tons of space dust that lands on the Earth every year. Pretty crazy. This is also a rather insignificant proportion of marine sediments, though. This is a figure from your textbook that summarizes a lot of what I just went over. What we have across the top is the size of the material. So boulders are large, gravels are smaller. Then we have sand size and mud size, which can be divided further into silt and clay. And so the biogenous constituents, you can see there's a huge range of sizes. The lithogenous materials are mostly sand, silt, and clay. The hydrogenous and cosmogenous components are not as significant as the other two and fall into the sand to silt size range. So that is a quick and dirty overview of ocean sediments. No pun intended. No, actually pun intended. Next up, we'll take a quick look at ocean resources.